Okay, hi everybody, welcome and thank you for joining our webinar today. It's good to see you all hopping on the call. We're going to get started probably about a minute past or a minute and a half past. We are just going to wait a little bit longer for a few more people to join. Cool, great to see so many of you joining us. Okay, and welcome to all the participants that just joined. Okay, cool. So let's get started. So hi, everybody. I hope that you are all doing well today. We are delighted to have so many of you join us today as we continue AnswerLab's spring webinar series to learn about taking the next step in inclusive UX and how to bridge the experience gap. So my name is Naomi. I am part of the team here at AnswerLab. And before we get going, I just want to very quickly run through a few housekeeping items. So firstly, I just want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and everyone that registered will receive a copy of the recording along with some additional resources via email afterwards. If you have any questions that you'd like to submit now or throughout the webinar, please do so via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and our speakers will get to as many as they can towards the end of the presentation. We have about 45 minutes of content today, including the time to get to your questions. So we will make sure that we keep to that to keep you on time for the rest of your day. Now, for those of you that don't know us, AnswerLab is a full-service UX research company that provides user experience research, consulting services, and flexible research engagement models to help companies apply a human-centered design process to every product that they launch. Our mission is to help create experiences that people love. And we know that too often underrepresented groups do not have great digital experiences. So we are on a mission to change that. And now on to our speakers for today. So today we have Kristin Zibell and Shakima Jackson-Martinez presenting. They are both part of our inclusivity team at AnswerLab, and they've been reworking how AnswerLab defines and incorporates inclusivity across all of our studies and research programs. Kristin is a principal UX researcher and product lead based out of the Bay Area. Kristin has more than 16 years of experience in human-centered design. She has worked with marketing and brand teams to understand people's behavior, ideate solutions, and validate experiences across their entire journey, particularly looking at methods and ways that research teams can include marginalized people in their research and product decisions. Shakima is AnswerLab's Manager of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. She's based out of New York and has over 10 years of experience working in human resources, project management, strategy, and operations. In her current role, she manages and measures diversity and inclusion strategies and programs across the entire organization. So with that, I will hand it over to our first speaker, Kristin.
Thanks so much, Naomi. So grateful to be here today speaking with all of you. I'm a member of AnswerLab's research team, and we believe that inclusive research is a critical piece of every UX research program. So you may have joined our webinar where we spoke about inclusive recruiting, and that's absolutely one step. We practice it at AnswerLab to ensure we're speaking with a diverse group of people for every study. But this is only the first step. The next step is to ask this question. Do you know how underrepresented groups experience your product or service? Does it help them or does it harm them? Here are some examples of harmful product experiences. An older woman is catfished on a popular dating app. She feels so much shame, but there's no safeguards built into the product. Black guests of a hospitality company are refused lodging because of racism. Young women hide their gender so they don't experience harassment by the men on the platform. And Black students are not seen by facial recognition AI in a classroom's meeting software. More recently, we've seen an example of a harmful product experience with Slack's new direct messaging feature. Twitter users were able to very quickly diagnose the problem in that in Slack's feature of being able to DM anyone at any company, including being able to send multiple invites with any text they wanted, was very problematic to users. Slack thankfully rolled back the feature almost immediately, but it's not the user's job to show when a product could be harmful, and it's certainly harmful after it's launched for the many people it might have affected. So I ask you again, in your next step in inclusive research, do you know how underrepresented groups experience your product or service? Does it harm or does it help them? To answer this question, the next step is to conduct experience gap research. Experience gap research is qualitative research with a very specific cohort of an underrepresented population to understand their user experience of a product or service. This could mean your Black users, your users who identify as women, users who identify as LGBTQIA or non-conforming gender identities. This could include users who are differently abled or non-cisgendered, among others. The benefits of conducting experience gap research is that you see what elements of the product experience may harm or may help a specific population. Not only that, but this research creates compassion, generates ideas, identifies or addresses those harmful features before they are launched, so you don't have the PR disasters that we've seen in the past harmful experiences. It also allows you to diversify your user data, so the voices of the underrepresented population are now a part of the company's data set on that product. And it allows also to benchmark the current experience. So if you want to show measurable results, you can benchmark what it is today, make the improvements, and benchmark it in the future to show that improvement. Some of the recent AnswerLab experience gap research, we've conducted over 60 studies of this type of inclusion research, and we have talked with youth on the autism spectrum, low technology populations, female gamers, BIPOC employee experiences, Black and Latinx small business owners. Some of the research questions we've asked are, what challenges might Black and Latinx small business owners face when using a product? How might we understand the social gaming experience for those who identify as women? And we ask these on behalf of our client and as a part of AnswerLab's Human-Centered Design Project. Now, those of you who have been to or started researching what inclusive recruiting is may have some questions about how experience gap research is different than inclusive and diverse recruiting. Now, as I mentioned, inclusive and diverse recruiting is that first step, and you can run it on any study. The experience gap research is a very specific type of study, and it asks the research questions: how does this specific population experience the product? What do they like about it? What concerns do they have? What impact does the current experience have on being able to accomplish their goals that they're using the product to complete? The methods are qualitative and exploratory or validation phases, and it's done with a live product to measure the current experience or prototype of the experience. And when I say experience, I mean a specific task flow with a clear start and endpoint. Now, the recruit is definitely where it makes a difference. In experience gap research, you have one study cohort made up entirely of individuals who are a member of the target audience and who have one specific identity, one specific underrepresented identity. So an example of this could be a target audience is first-time homebuyers, and their specific identity would be Asian American. So you're looking at the study intentionally is looking at the experience gap of how do first-time home buyers who identify as Asian American experience the product. Now, this is different from an inclusive and diverse recruit because the goal of inclusive and diverse recruiting is to make sure that cohort includes a diverse mix of individuals who identify with one or more identities. So that are underrepresented. So an example of this could be a target audience of home buyers, and then you're looking for maybe 6 or 8 participants, a portion of whom identify as African American, Latinx, Asian American. So there's a mix of racial or ethnic identities. Half of the identities are not male, So they identify as women, and half may live in rural versus urban areas. So this is a diverse recruit, and can happen on any study at any time, whereas experience gap research has very specific of one identity for the cohort. And when you understand, and when you do this, you're really looking to do it when you're understanding your users in exploration, running ideas by them, and then when you're validating your designs in the validation phase as well, especially to catch anything before launch. So why is it necessary to conduct experience gap research? Well, in the United States, we have a dominant culture, and that dominant culture has identities of white, masculine, cisgendered, which means identifying with the same gender as when you were born, able-bodied, straight, US citizen, Christian, and individualist. And what this means, because the US has a dominant culture, is that all of us who live and experience the US culture have inherent biases that we bring to our product decisions, we bring to looking at our research and the voices of those we talk to. We bring these biases into our recruiting, and we bring these biases into the need for DEI research. What this also means is that anyone who identifies as marginalized, underrepresented, or decentered are considered others. And because of the marginalization that is present in the US dominant culture, we make decisions about products and research every day in our work and our lives that may harm people with identities such as people of color, feminine, and that could mean male or female, think Harry Styles on the cover of Vogue, non-binary, transgender, differently abled, LGBTQIA+, non-citizen, Muslim, Hindu, Jewish, Sikh, and non-Christian faiths, or anyone who's community-oriented. And what this also means that people who identify or support individuals who identify with the characteristics of dominant culture is that we center them so that they're safe. And the epitome of this privilege and the supremacy is that we think, oh, if I'm okay because I experienced the product one way, then everyone else is okay. I'm safe, so they're safe. And this is simply not true. I share with you a tweet about this privilege. And white privilege, US dominant culture privilege, is your history being part of the core curriculum and mine being taught as an elective. And I think this carries through to our product decisions, where the whiteness, the dominant culture, is the majority of the product decisions and user research decisions, and everything else is being taught as optional. And we're here to say that experience gap research is necessary to define what is not optional, to say we must do this in order to highlight the voices of the underrepresented in our products. So let's dive into that experience gap and how you can start doing it today on your products. So there's 6 steps, and I'll go through each of them briefly. You can dive a little deeper into the how-to on the experience gap research article that AnswerLab published a few weeks ago. The link will be at the end. So the first step is to do your homework. And this is very important, that you must do your homework about the population who you want to interview and as a part of the user research. And this is because your participants are not there to educate you on who they are and how they experience the US dominant culture. So you never want to ask a question like, tell me what it's like to be a trans person or a person who identifies as trans. What are your big challenges? That puts them in harm's way, but that also gives them the burden of educating you. And it's our job to come to our research sessions fully educated about our target audience and their identity. So simply Google, what is it like to be a trans person, before you conduct any research, and begin your own learning process before speaking to anyone who identifies as trans or any other identity of the cohort you're going to be doing user or experience gap research on. Second, because experience gap research is a very specific type of research, you want to formulate very clear research questions. And that starts with defining the product experience that you'd like to research. And again, an experience has a clear starting and stopping point of steps a user must go through. So you want to look at significant product experiences like sign up, registration, onboarding, whatever the core tasks of your product is, changing profiles, seeking help, canceling service. And you want to conduct experience studies on each one of these with, with specific underrepresented groups. An example of research questions are really about identifying how they feel about the product experience, either on the current site or in a prototype, what they find valuable, what they find concerning, what assumptions your team has that this group's understanding is definitely challenging, and then what might be a better experience to address their concerns. A third step is that when you're looking to screen and recruit the participants, you want to fully understand and define the underrepresented population to recruit. So an example is defining them by ethnicity. So because Experience Gap is looking at a specific population with one identity, your recruiting criteria would pick, if you wanted to talk to a specific ethnic or racial identity, one of these options. And this is pulled from the AnswerLab inclusive recruiting screener. And so let's say in that example of first-time Asian American home buyers, I would recruit participants who qualified for the study and who checked the Asian ethnicity box. And also make sure that the screener language matches the population's identity language. So AnswerLab learned this in our own studies when we had a racial ethnic identity on our screeners that said Black, for Black participants as a racial and ethnic identity. And what we found out is that we had a participant pool of first-generation African-American immigrants, and they had very different experiences and challenges when we really wanted to talk to foundational Black Americans who had been, AnswerLab wanted to talk to foundational Black Americans who had been in America for several generations and get their experiences on, I believe it was the application process. Now, this is an example where we should have done our homework ahead of time. So we learned in that, and then actually had one of our employees write an exceptional piece on our blog about the different shades of Black. It's also important to select the research monitor with intention. So we definitely don't want to assume that you need a moderator of the same identity as the population. So this is because it might cause undue harm or tokenize the moderator and researcher. It's very important that you speak with them about the moderator if they're interested in this, or pick a moderator who has experience talking about the topic and has done inclusive research in the past, especially if the research requires a participant to be vulnerable, talk about deeply personal details. Make sure the moderator is trained in reflective listening and has had anti-bias training so the participants feel heard and held. And this leads me to my next tip on how to conduct experience gap research. And that's to make sure to moderate with awareness of unconscious bias. At AnswerLab, we've all been trained in anti-bias training, but we have to continue to practice to make sure, especially these 5 biases, affinity, confirmation, attribution, halo, and Horn's effect bias show up. And essentially all of these biases are present because of our US dominant culture, and they're so insidious because as a researcher, if we bring them with us, if we moderate as if we are better than or our participants are less than, and we don't elevate their voices, we don't believe their responses, we don't see the themes that are there, we are essentially silencing them and dulling the purpose of experience gap research. So we have to make sure that we are aware of our own unconscious biases, especially these 5, and that we are trained to moderate without them. And then finally, it's very important in experience gap research to report insights, no matter what you hear, fearlessly and fully. Experience gap research and any DEI research requires a great amount of humility to say, hey, as a product team, we probably don't have this right. So it's very important as a researcher to highlight participants' stories and share their suggestions and solutions. Make sure their voices are fully heard, not only in their stories, but also in their quotes, and use quotes from a mix of participants, and don't quote the same participants repeatedly, so the richness of all the participants' experience and feedback come through in the results. When you're providing insights, make sure there's a few short-term actionable ones so the team can make small, meaningful changes. And when sharing the report and the readout, ask for who's taking accountability on following up on these issues. And watch, is it making it into the backlog? Are these issues getting onto the product roadmap? Is there another study with another population that you can schedule right away, or a follow-up study with this population you can schedule to gather more insights or make sure the changes have been made? Your job as the researcher with experience gap research is to make sure that this population's voices are heard so that they are included in product decisions. So now I'll turn it over to my colleague Shakima, who will go into our next session.
Thank you, Kristin. So over the next few minutes, we'll dive into one of the most common questions that's asked when teams are thinking about conducting inclusive research, which is, how do I get my stakeholders on board? And while there are many ways that you can answer this, we recommend starting with a comprehensive approach in the form of a business case. The purpose of a business case is to justify the reasoning for initiating a project or task. And your business case should not only outline the need for inclusive research, but the goals, options, and next steps your team will take to design and execute an inclusive research study. Next slide. So before you move into actually building your business case, you'll want to start with your company's internal commitments to diversity and inclusion. Last year, we all navigated the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic while watching racial tensions escalate nationwide. And on the heels of multiple horrific events, many companies issued statements in support of Black Lives Matter and reaffirmed their commitments to racial justice and equality. If your organization released a statement, donated funds, or committed internal resources to diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, then chances are these issues may be top of mind for internal influencers. If action steps are being taken to center the voices of underrepresented individuals within your workplace or community, then you can advocate to take this a step further by also amplifying the diverse voices of your customers. Ultimately, this is about accountability and aligning external statements with internal initiatives. Next slide. So here we'll get into how to actually build your business case. And there are 4 very important areas that you'll want to cover when creating your business case for inclusive research. First, you'll want to acknowledge the default. And basically, this is coming to an understanding of who is centered and who is not in product development. Next, you'll want to outline the benefits of inclusive research, many of which Kristin shared earlier. Then you'll move to presenting your options, and lastly, creating an implementation plan. Next slide. So there was actually a great article published yesterday in USA Today that talks about the lack of BIPOC representation in product management. And the overall theme of the article was that more diverse teams are less likely to build products that are inadvertently racist. So when advocating for inclusive research, there must be a foundational understanding that the wants and needs of BIPOC individuals are not always top of mind in the product development process. And we know this because we've heard the stories of harm that BIPOC individuals have encountered with products featuring AI or facial recognition software. With the lack of BIPOC representation in the product development process, chances are these voices remain marginalized while whiteness becomes the baseline or the norm. And when whiteness is the default, it is difficult for the experiences, pain points, and needs of BIPOC individuals to be centered and therefore may present as an afterthought. A recent survey by the Alliance for Global Inclusion found that only 1 in 12 major global companies has a formal process to make sure product design is inclusive of different cultural backgrounds and abilities. And this is why inclusive research is so important, because it allows you to intentionally amplify marginalized voices. And your stakeholders must understand this default and be willing to make space in order to successfully execute these studies. Next step. So in this step, you'll want to outline the benefits of inclusive research to your stakeholders. And if you can make this custom to your product, that would be ideal, but we've listed a few benefits here that we feel are most prominent. The first, inclusive research allows you to gather unique perspectives from users with varied backgrounds and lived experiences. Designing a product based on the profile of one consumer may not be representative of the entire range of your customer base. And so hearing from diverse voices during the product development process can help your company build more universally appealing products. This research also helps you uncover features that may harm or unintentionally exclude certain users, like app filters that lighten skin or emojis that are not representative of different skin tones. And lastly, you'll avoid potentially launching a product containing culturally insensitive elements. Next slide. So next, you'll want to present all of the inclusive research options to your team. And as Kristin mentioned earlier, an inclusive recruit is the first step in hearing from diverse voices. However, taking that to the next level would be conducting experience gap research to speak with a specific underrepresented group. You'll want to present these options to your stakeholders along with your suggested methodology to determine what works best for your team. Next slide, please. And then lastly, you'll want to create your implementation plan, which will give your stakeholders a complete overview of the goals, options, and next steps for the project. So you'll start with what is the goal of the research? What is the question that this research would like to answer? And it's okay if this is entirely unclear from the beginning, because the initial research can be more exploratory in nature. Next, you'll want to outline how the research will be conducted based on your presented options. And so this is your chance to flesh out how each of the inclusive research options that you're presenting will contribute to a fully formed study. Next, you'll want to talk about the resources that are necessary to successfully execute a study. You should consider if your team should work with an outside consultancy who's experienced in inclusive research to guide you on this journey. Or if you decide to moderate in-house, what resources would you need to provide to the moderator, such as unconscious bias training or any other type of assistance? And then lastly, stakeholder involvement. Of course, you need to outline who is going to take part in the research process and what their level of involvement will entail. Expectations should be set around timelines and deliverables that all team members can adhere to. Next slide. So we want to acknowledge that during this process, you may often be navigating fragility. And resistance, while it is uncomfortable, it can be expected in this situation. And we think that the best way to meet resistance is to lean into it with inquiry, to ask questions, to help address the resistance and the why behind the research. Also, encouraging your stakeholders to have a dialogue is very important. You have to talk about why this resistance is coming up, and it'll help all of you uncover potential roadblocks and create a collective path forward. And then lastly, if you feel that you're being met with resistance that is too difficult to navigate, or if there are instances of defensiveness or denial that feels pervasive, we encourage you to lean on your internal DEI staff and resources to help you navigate the situation. And now I will turn it over to Naomi for Q&A.
Great, thank you, Shakima and Kristin. So let's take a look at some of these questions, and also feel free to continue to use the Q&A box. The first one I'm seeing here, what anti-bias training would you recommend for researchers and moderators?
That is a great question. So internally, we actually did unconscious bias training, and then we actually did implicit bias training as well. There are a number of companies that do this training. We personally used ReadySet, as there's a D&I consultancy to conduct this training for us. And there's also another one, Humanity Centered, that actually works exclusively exploring the topic of D&I in UX research.
Great, thank you. The next question here is, I'm curious what language you use in both screeners and interviews to ask about various identities. Do participants understand why you're asking them these questions? And in your experience, have they been understanding?
Yes, absolutely. So we internally had a task force working on the screener, and they went through many iterations. Our research ops team is the best, I believe, the best in the business. So they made sure it was very carefully worded. And there's definitely an intro in the screener that talks about why we're collecting the information. And then each question has a prefer not to say has a prefer not to say option, so the respondent does not have to answer.
Thank you, Kristin. The next one here says, I saw a study that said Latinx is the least preferred label and most people prefer Hispanic. How do you keep up with these types of trends or fluctuations in culture?
I can actually take that. So that is correct. Actually, it honestly comes down, from what I'm seeing, is to age. And so more millennials actually prefer the Latinx term to the Hispanic term. So I think what we do, and what I do personally, is lots of research to stay on top of what the trends are, especially around language. DEI language is constantly evolving. So you have to, in a sense, be on the pulse of what is changing. And we also do want to make sure that we are using the terms that are relevant for the groups that we're speaking to, right? So where Latinx may be more relevant to millennial Hispanics, the actual term Hispanic is actually more relevant to older Hispanics. And so just making sure that you are kind of on top of the terms, and that you're constantly in the DEI space. There's lots of publications and articles and things of that nature. And I just, education, constant education to make sure that I'm staying on top of it.
Thank you. This next question, I'm curious about how to plan for coverage of all groups, which seems a bit impossible for international products. This person is trying to understand how to do this type of research without leaving groups out.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the good news is that there's a lot of, well, this is not good news. Apologies for saying that. There's opportunity to talk to a lot of underrepresented populations, because the dominant culture, not only in the U.S. but in the world, is very singular. And what we recommend starting with is a Black population as the first study, then women, and then LGBTQIA+. So this covers 3 different types of identities, but then immediately after talking with these 3, start to phase in other abilities, so differently abled, as well as different age groups, different rural or urban, and then also thinking about access to technology, and then race and ethnicities throughout. And Shakima, is there anything else you'd like to add? I feel like I flummoxed that answer a little bit.
No, I think that was actually perfect, Kristin.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Next question here is, can you give any specific examples or ways of socializing this with stakeholders that you've seen work for other clients?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what we've seen is not only an interest from our clients to want to do this. So there's some socialization that has already happened, but then also in making sure that we have something called an AnswerLab pledge that we have at the beginning of every we're starting to roll out at the beginning of every project, that says we're committed to inclusivity, and we do inclusive recruiting. We create safe spaces for participants, and we ask participants and team members who are not inclusive to leave. So we make sure that this is clear at the beginning of the projects, and to set expectations and to show by example. And then also when we're sharing out results, we make sure that the voices of the participants are heard, their stories are in there, their direct quotes are in there, video clips are in there, to really make sure that they're heard.
Thanks, Kristin. This question says, the shades of Black example that you gave earlier, could you speak a little bit more on how you approach research regarding Black American / foundational versus African or immigrant?
Well, yes, that was a very important lesson we learned. And in the context of the experience gap research, and my recommendation about starting with a specific underrepresented group, I say Black and I mean foundational Black American if the research is in the US, because of white supremacy and the historical oppression since 1619, when slaves were first brought to America. That history requires that we make sure that those voices are those specific underrepresented voices are heard, because most of the harm has been done. So that's how we approach it.
Thank you. Are there any qualitative methods that you recommend in particular for this type of research? And are there any potential pitfalls to look out for with specific methods?
Definitely in exploratory research with in-depth interviews, diary studies when we get back in person, ethnographic studies. So, and then with validation research, usability studies, as well as in-depth interviews for validation purposes or contextual walkthroughs. I think the biggest thing to watch out for as researchers is kind of making sure we do our homework. And one of the things that I like to see in the screener is their level of comfort in sharing. So in doing any research with identities on how identities are presented online, we make sure we ask their permission. Are you comfortable sharing your screen in the sessions? And so for ethnographic research, really making sure that everyone is very comfortable sharing their home. And everyone on the team who might be watching, observing, or attending has gone through the necessary anti-bias training and has been prepped to make sure that any biases are kept on the door. They are observers, they're silent, to make sure that the participants' safety and care is at the forefront.
Thanks, Kristin. This next question is also related to methods. You mentioned benchmarking. Where would you start to create a product benchmark for this type of research?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely because you're looking at the experience gap and what it is today. So how does this experience for a certain population compare to what we assume works today? So it's just really about picking a specific experience like onboarding, registration, the core action experiences, getting help, and identifying attitudinal measures or behavioral measures like task completion and attitudinal measures of satisfaction and safety, and then running it today, finding issues, making those product changes or coming out with a prototype to address those changes, and then running another benchmarking study with those same measures to show whether or not it was successful.
Great, thank you. This next question is, my organization has not made specific DEI commitments and is not focused on this yet. What can I do as a next step if my company isn't there yet?
That's a great question. And I always advise people in this situation to start asking questions of your organization. Usually DEI is often aligned with HR in most companies. And so if you feel comfortable going to someone in an HR role or someone in a leadership position, to start asking questions about why DEI hasn't been brought up, or why this isn't a topic, or if it's even important within the org. And I think that's like the first step. You start to ask those questions. And if you start to notice that this really isn't something that people are having a conversation about, you can align with others in the org who you feel comfortable with and who may be having these conversations in more smaller pockets, or you can actually be the person to try and push this forward. And of course, I would say, going in, you probably would need some outside resources. So certainly look to third parties for help and assistance. But yeah, if it's not happening, if the conversation is not happening, then there is a little bit of responsibility for you to start it.
Thanks, Shakima. This next question is, my company is trying to build out the inclusive research process and recruitment pipeline. What are the milestones and steps that we can take to prove success and create momentum moving forward?
Do you want to take that, Shakima?
Sure. Let's see, milestones for success. Well, when it comes to inclusive recruitment, I think if this is something that you're newly starting, then immediately, you have nothing to benchmark it against. So I know internally we look at the numbers, right? We have metrics internally where we look at, okay, here's the number of studies that we've recruited, and then this is what the actual population count was for each study. So I would say that's a first level, that's a first measure of success, when you can actually say, we conducted X amount of studies last year with, this many participants all falling into these demographics. And this year, this is what we've done. That's definitely success. When it comes to research, I think, Kristin, I'll turn that over to you to.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think just like Shakima says, the first milestone is understanding where you're at and tracking what studies you're doing that are specifically focusing on elevating the voices of underrepresented populations in your product decision processes. So it's starting by looking at your current product experiences. So a first milestone is identifying those product experiences where you don't know if they help or harm a specific population, and then run experience gap research. So for example, in the first-time home buyers, if that's your target audience, or if your target audience is TV viewers or banking banking customers, do a study with those who identify in that target audience who are Black, and see what their experience is with their product, and does it help and does it harm, and get their feedback. That's the first milestone. I think, in my opinion, is that there's been a lot of focus on reading lists and book clubs and discussing, and that's great. Education is absolutely the first step, but we're at a point now where there's no checklist. It's time for action. So I think a first milestone is, what in your sphere of influence, is it inclusive recruiting? Is it an experience gap study? Can you and your team take on to show that you are interested in inclusive research and getting this data from these populations to improve and elevate your product?
Thank you. It looks like we will have time for one or two more. Can you speak more to covering international D&I research?
Yeah, that's definitely something we're thinking about. Our work has been primarily focused on the U.S. dominant culture, and so I personally am going to be looking at how kind of the global colonial dominant culture permeates into product decisions. But I think, it's really about knowing who is underrepresented in the local markets populations, and making sure that those voices, and you can certainly use the identities that we've talked about here today, and making sure it's safe for them to speak, because definitely some countries make it very unsafe for people who are marginalized to talk. So going forward, we've done projects in India for more rural those in rural populations. We've in making sure that their voices are heard. So I think it's really understanding the local market, using the identities with care, and then going forth with the recruiting and experience gap work that makes sense for the product and the market.
Great, thank you both so much. We are getting really close to the end of our 45 minutes. So I think that's all the time that we have for questions for today. If we didn't get to your question, I'm sorry. Taking the next step in inclusive research generally will bring up a lot of questions, but we are writing about this topic and posting about it frequently on our Insights blog, so you can always find more information there. And if you have any questions about specific research or advice, you can contact us at answerlab.com/experiencegapresearch. So with that, I would like to thank you all for joining today. And just remind you that you will receive a copy of the webinar recording shortly. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day.